Hello. All right, so let me get the names down. Are there any questions? Questions or comments? As I'm getting the names down, note that on your quizzes, or on your fourth quiz, I had made an accident, and it defaults for each question to be worth 1 point, and I intended them to be worth 5 points each. Okay, and so you got a raw score on quiz 4 out of 5, but it's going to be out of 25. And so I changed it. I went back and changed it. And so it shows your raw score. So let's say you got a 5 out of 5. It might be showing that you got a 5 out of 25. Don't worry about it. When I get to quiz 4, I multiply your answer by 5. All right. So I'll be sure to that you won't suffer for that mistake. And that should be the only quiz of the 6 in which I made that mistake.
I had a question regarding the quizzes.
Sure.
I've been working on them, but they just all need to be done by Monday, right?
Yes. If you could, please. I don't have it down as far as a policy for the quizzes being in late. What I have done by habit most of the time is I've deducted 5 points in fairness to everyone else from your raw score. So you get, 20 out of 25, you get 4 out of the 5 right. I give you a 15 out of 25. So that's probably what I would do in fairness to everybody else. But yeah, I need to put that in my syllabus. I've always thought about the assignments and what I want to give as far as a score and what I want to deduct in fairness to everyone for late assignments, but I've yet to put into the syllabus anything regarding the quizzes. So yeah, do your best, okay? Do your best to try to turn them in by midnight of Monday. And
excuse me, are they all shot after that first one?
I'm sorry, Melissa, your voice kind of could you say that again?
Oh, yeah. Are all the quizzes one try?
After
Like
I
one
believe it's after
attempt?
quiz 2. It might even be after quiz 3. The first 2 or 3 quizzes are unlimited. And then after that, yeah, just one try.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right, so let me go ahead and share the page with this week's assignment. So number one, I intended to be court history of the Civil War. All right, the history that we were taught as kids. Okay, and that is that it was a moral crusade to end slavery, and that the North represented all that which was progressive, humanitarian, in line with the rhetoric of the founding fathers. And you might say, okay, how was it in line with the rhetoric of the founding fathers when they gave the, the implicit, acceptance of slavery? Well, basically, the Declaration of Independence than the Constitution, right? And then some of their other writings independent of the Constitution, and making that claim. So that's arguable, right? Because they did defend and implement institutionalize slavery. We can't get around that. And so at any rate, with number one, you're looking at an anomalously idealistic generation, a generation that was out of the ordinary, that was extraordinary, that was not typical, okay? and that what they did is that they caused enough, they brought about enough agitation to force the country to have discourse on slavery. All right, to force the country to have discourse on slavery. And how did they do that? They made a lot of noise, and they were helped by polarizing events that tended to, sorry, I'm putting in another name, someone who just joined. They forced the country to have discourse on slavery. So let's look into this claim of a generation in the antebellum, before the Civil War of 1861, generation that wanted to change and improve man, change and improve society and institutions. All right. And there is some evidence for that. Okay. Firstly, right, you had a second Great Awakening. Charles Finney really jumps out with the Second Great Awakening. And one of the themes of the Second Great Awakening, right, was perfectionism. They wanted to perfect man. There was this optimism, especially amongst born-again Christians. Again, a lot of religion here, but the idea, like what the Puritans carried over, right, is they shared a notion of original sin, and the Second Great Awakening didn't harp on that too heavily. But that you're born with a natural inclination to do the opposite of what God intends you to do, with the Mosaic law and Jesus's beatitudes, etc., and the in Scripture and the Bible. And so Jesus told Nicodemus that you have to be born again to go to heaven. And so the Protestants are really big, as demographically somewhat of arguably a culturally and institutionally Protestant country. That's arguable. But the United States, right, a lot of emphasis on being born again. And so when you're born again, it's supposed to counteract the force of original sin. Now you have the Holy Spirit inside you, you have Jesus living in you, and now you're equipped to live the way God wants you to live. And that's why the Puritans, right, were big on only the born again could rule. Because they felt like people who are not born again are so beholden to original sin that they don't have much of a chance of living a virtuous and ruling, virtuous lifestyle and ruling in a virtuous manner. So at any rate, with the Second Great Awakening, they felt like if you could just be born again and become a Christian, that the sky was a limit as to how holy of a life you could live. And so that sense of perfectionism may have, to whatever degree, this is arguable, carried over into the abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, all right, for man to perfect himself and to perfect his environment. As far as his environment goes, I think of the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalism movement became in vogue in the 1830s with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, right, in the group of Concord, Massachusetts intellectuals. And there was a movement, right, where they wanted man to transcend his, I think of like kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whereby you're just living like an animal. You're living for your basic necessities, refuge from the elements, food and water, and just your basic necessities, right? But they wanted you to transcend that type of lifestyle, of that type of just world. And so at any rate, with the Transcendentalists, they wanted everyone to experience self-cultivation, to cultivate yourself to the utmost. They wanted everyone to become Renaissance men and women. So you cultivate your brain, you cultivate your body, you cultivate your intellect, of course, you cultivate your spirit. And there was like a heavily spiritual side to the Transcendentalists as well, where it kind of predated the beatniks and the existentialists over 100 years later, whereby they contended that your purpose for living, your reason for being alive is going to be different from individual to individual. And the best way to do that, to ascertain your purpose in life, was through personal enrichment and personal experience, and by habit, by virtuous habit. And so they did not want you to look to tradition. They didn't want you to look to the leaders of all the American institutions, because they felt like they'd only brought Americans so far, and they had failed to do their job. And encouraging and giving the freedom to people to live out their lives to the utmost. And so hence some of them, like Thoreau, bordered on anarchism, on no government whatsoever. They wanted no coercive institutions that told man how to act and how not to act. They wanted man to figure that out on him by himself. And so they established these communes, if you will. So if you look up New Harmony in Indiana, Brook Farm in Oneida, and these other experiments, they tried these communes where people were free. I say on paper they were to be relatively more free than under society, to cultivate themselves and to find out their reason for living, etc. But there was a bit of a irony there when you look into those. A couple of them ended up kind of descending into somewhat of a tyrannical government, which was the exact antithesis of what was intended. But at any rate, the attempt was there, right? To have these utopian societies, these perfect societies. And such was their disregard for institutions and for traditional, cultural restraints, that some of them offered free love. They really challenged the historical norms of normalcy, if you will. And so at any rate, very interesting subject to look into. And then others, right, were concerned by the changes that you're seeing in the 10th through 14th chapters of Alan Brinkley's textbook. America was beginning to become industrialized up in the north, at least, and bourgeois, city oriented. And new problems come, right, from urbanization. You don't have the institutional framework established quite yet for like a police force to deal with crime, to deal with poverty and the homeless, and other types of issues that almost inevitably arise with quick urbanization. And so you have these kind of these reform movements that are trying to improve the problems of burgeoning industrialization. They want to fight against crime. They want to fight against vice. And with vice, right, they felt like vice was a byproduct of apathy, that whereby the people just didn't care anymore, where social mobility was declining, people's opportunity to achieve the American dream, that there was beginning to become established a deeply rutted gulf between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the poor. And the poor were decreasingly able to get out of the mire of their poverty. And so hence they were becoming apathetic. You know, I think of like Lyndon B. Johnson, well over 100 years later, talking about a culture of despair, a culture of poverty, where people just turn to drugs and alcohol, prostitution, etc., when they lose hope in achieving the American dream. So you have reform movements that are directly oriented to that. And not to mention, I think of Thoreau again with the Transcendentalist, and thinking that bourgeois society, bourgeois culture in the cities was staid. It was it was colorless. Again, like the beatniks, a little about in the 1950s. The idea that you're living to have 2.5 kids, the white picket fence, you work 9 to 5, and for what? To get a nice boat, to get a nice car. There's got to be more to life than that. And so you have these reform movements that are trying to get people to get away from bourgeois conformity to poverty-related apathy, and different types of vices that were connected to that apathy. And they were trying to generally just improve and uplift humanity, especially the underdogs. All right. So you had movements like prison reform. You have movements for those that were suffering from psychological ailments, like Dorothea Dix, DIX, very fascinating subject. And well, at that time, they were called insane asylums. You had also, along with the transcendentalists, you had a movement of romanticism that carried across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, Coleridge and these other people, Lord Byron. And it was an emotional movement somewhat. It was getting away from rationalism, industrialization, and romantically wanted people to follow their impulses, follow their intuition, follow their emotions, and try to find a deeper meaning to life than just feeding your stomach. And so at any rate, you have evidence of that by way of, again, the utopian movements and the reform movements. So other reform movements, you had health fads that came about, right? Like Sylvester Graham of the famous graham cracker fame, and these movements to try to improve people's general well-being by having a better diet, by hot water treatment, by exercise. So all of this was happening in the 1830s and 1840s pretty strongly. So is it a coincidence? According to number one, it's not. That this was an anomalously out of the ordinary, idealistic generation that wanted to improve society, that wanted to improve man, and was no longer content with the old political American tradition of just adhering to just that, adhering to authority and adhering to tradition, but that they wanted people to challenge what institutional leaders, when I say institutional leaders, I think of the major institutions of family, like dads, of schools, teachers and professors, of churches, reverends and priests, and of government, right? And so at any rate, they wanted you to challenge what you were told and to find your own route, so to speak, right? And then you had early notions of like with Henry David Thoreau again, of nonviolent civil disobedience, of a notion of natural laws, right? Albeit some of them were connected with the abolitionists, were connected to religion, to Christianity, going back to the Second Great Awakening, and going to the Mosaic law through Moses of the Old Testament, and the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament, and the epistles of St. Paul and Peter, et cetera, and the apostles. And the idea is, right, is that they laid down a higher law as far as what is right and wrong, as far as normative behavior and how people ought to live. And that civic laws, man-made government laws, sometimes get it right according to those higher laws, and sometimes get it wrong. And when they get it wrong, it is the societal obligation, responsibility of the average citizen to challenge those civic laws and protest them, so that they can begin to adhere to the higher laws. And so, of course, right, you also had a little bit of, as far as an undergirding philosophy, despite the fact that Romanticism was against the Enlightenment and it was more emotional oriented, with some of the utopian movements where they were trying to have like a scientific, a scientific, what's the word I'm thinking of? It's eluding me right now. Like in mathematics, formula, in science, a formula for happiness. So for instance, so many hours of the week, you would engage in self-cultivation by learning a new trade of some sort. Certain number of hours of the week, you were to read and to cultivate your intellect. certain numbers of hours of the week, you would engage in manual labor with your hands. And certain number of hours a week, you were to exercise. And certain number of hours a week, you were to engage in some type of civic or social altruism, putting the needs of other people above your own and serving fellow man. So some that having that type of almost scientific formula for happiness, I think of like who did that was Thomas Jefferson, our third president. You have a kind of a reopening of the Enlightenment as well as an undergirding philosophy. So with the Enlightenment, with the Second Great Awakening, with Transcendentalism, with Romanticism, all of these serve to function as a catalyst to get that generation of the 1830s and 40s, right, to challenge what they were told by their societal leaders and to try to improve and protest and to engage in reforms, etc., to make man and make society and make institutions better. Okay. And so it was this kind of catalyst that brought about the Civil War, according to court history. All right. And remember, court history, it praises the winners in history. It justifies what they do. Court history is also tied to American exceptionalism, that we're a special country. And after all, right, you don't want to fight. You're not a special, exceptional country if you fight over power, right? There's nothing exceptional or romantic about that. But it's the notion that you're fighting for something lofty, something higher than that. And so in this case, we're fighting to adhere to Judeo-Christian principles, to Enlightenment principles, right? To Transcendentalist principles that are higher than just some institutional American tradition of turning a blind eye to certain things like slavery. Okay. And so these reformers, they rock the boat, but in a good way, right? And then if that's not strong enough as far as on the societal level, I mean, let's get a little bit more into the abolitionists. So you had prison reform, you had educational reform, you had vice crusades in the cities, especially, right? You had utopian movements. You had a philosophical movement of transcendentalism and a second great awakening, etc. And then you also had, in particular, had the abolitionists. They saw slavery as immoral, as sinful, right? And they didn't care that the Constitution had originally included it and sanctioned it. That didn't matter to them. They wanted it ended, and they wanted it to be ended rather abruptly. And so what are some constitutional issues to this? Is for one, the obvious we've already mentioned, is that the Constitution originally, you have a fugitive slave law, you have the 3/5 clause, you have the property and contract clause that are implicitly allowing slavery. So you have to deal with that, right? Then you have the English political tradition of slaves being in the court of law seen as chattel property, as agricultural property, no different from a farm implement or a mule, etc., sadly. And so you have to contend with that, right? And then to add to it, you have the issue of the Western territories applying for statehood. Okay, so they're formal territories, but they're not states yet. Okay, and so they're in a altogether kind of, for lack of a better adjective, a different category, right? And so to the abolitionists, they saw loopholes, right? And some of them didn't even care about loopholes. So for instance, one of the most famous and infamous was William Lloyd Garrison. And he had a copy of the Constitution and he burnt it and said that the founding fathers made a pact with the devil and allowing the immoral institution of slavery. And so basically to heck with the Constitution, that at the very least, they should just have a new amendment that abolishes it. And if not, the heck with deference toward the Constitution. Well, not all abolitionists were that strong in their opposition. Some, like Abraham Lincoln, prided themselves on being moderate, being kind of in the middle of the road. So what they did is they said, well, we find evidence of the founding fathers intending for slavery to eventually die out as the republic grows, as it ages, as it industrializes, and as it expands. Although to what degree they knew it would expand is arguable, right? Westwardly, and so they said that it's completely within the the worldview and the intentions of the founding fathers for slavery to eventually die out. They also saw the Northwest ordinances laid out, particularly by Thomas Jefferson. And then the Northwest ordinances in the Ohio Valley, the founding fathers forbade slavery in the Ohio Valley. And it was not yet, they were not yet states. It was formal territory. So they saw that as a huge loophole, right? And saying, well, these territories to the west are not yet states that we've grabbed from Mexico, that we bought in the Louisiana Purchase, et cetera, right? And that we kind of diplomatically bullied from the English in the Oregon Territory. And so at any rate, they stated that the federal government has the right to forbid, to prohibit slavery in these territories because they're not yet states. All right. And so at any rate, that was increasingly popular amongst those who were in the, who called themselves conscience Whigs, and who later in the early 1850s would establish the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was for free labor. They wanted to utilize people like Abraham Lincoln as an embodiment, right, of the American dream. That here's this guy born in Kentucky and grows up in Indiana and Illinois, self-taught, right, originally illiterate, very, very little formal education, grown up in the frontier regions, right, relatively poor. And look at him now, having made himself, in multiple manners. And they had him splitting rails with an axe, showing his physical strength and showing the fact that he, by the sweat of his own brow, he had arisen. And so at any rate, they offered free labor to other people, to their voters, right? And they were against the extension of slavery to the West, all right? And now to some of these new Republicans, right, they wanted slavery abolished right away. They not only wanted to prohibit it from spreading into the Western territories, but they wanted to enact an amendment that prohibited slavery in the states where it already existed. Abraham Lincoln was not so far. He did not do that. In his first inaugural speech, when the South, 11 states of the South left the Union, when he was elected as president, right, in 1860, he promised them and said, please do not secede from the country. This will mean civil war. I'm not just going to let you go. I'm going to fight to keep you in the Union. And he says, basically, I have neither the constitutional power nor the personal inclination to interfere where slavery already exists, right? In Virginia, in the Carolinas, etc., where it was sanctioned by state law. But instead, he said, right, I just don't want it to spread anywhere else to the West. And so those who not only did not want it to spread to the West, but who wanted it to be abolished everywhere, including in the states where it was already sanctioned, were seen as radical Republicans, right? They were seen as radicals even by their own fellow Republicans. And so, and not to mention, the Republican Party also was for Alexander Hamilton's plan of urbanization, commerce or trade, government subsidizing industries that are ostensibly good for the whole country. Again, contending that free labor was the American way to rise up in the factory, etc. But there was also a pro big business side to the Republican Party, no doubt, from the very get-go. And so at any rate, these radical Republicans really stood out even amongst their own fellow Republican platform and people, party members, in the approach they took to politics. Because remember, prior to this, it was that, hey, leave the slavery issue alone, or at least have some type of compromising stance when it comes to slavery. That compromise was the word, right? It was an axiom you didn't question. And so they were no longer doing that in the antebellum period under this new Republican Party. So you had Salmon Chase, you had Charles Sumner, and I have a list of radical Republicans in number one, right, who were not okay with compromise. So for instance, a compromising stance was allow the Western states to decide for themselves if they want slavery or not, right? Have either a popular referendum for all the inhabitants therein, in Nebraska, in Kansas, etc., or have an election of representatives and let that legislator, those elected legislative assemblymen, let them decide if you were to have slavery or not, right? And that was at the time period, like in the 1850s, when that issue was brought forth. It seems like people like Stephen Douglas and others who advocated that were immediately rewarded by receiving the majority of votes. So that seems to have been a popular stance. But Lincoln, right, differentiated himself, and while he was certainly not a radical Republican by almost anyone's standards, he began to take more of a strong stance when it came to this, as he stated that, no, we don't have a democracy. We live in a republic, in a mixed republic, right? That is partly democratic, partly aristocratic, partly monarchical. And he said, no, this is too important of a decision to be left up to the people in the West themselves. That Congress or even the president has the power to forbid slavery in the Western territories. And so hence he was known as the tyrant to many in the South, who would on his own unilaterally say no to the spreading, the dissemination of slavery to anywhere in the Western territories, because he simply felt it was immoral. All right. And so that was a way of him bringing about the opposition of the Southern states to him. So at any rate, let's see here. So what did some of them do is they issued speeches, right, that were very polarizing. They almost made you pick a side, right? And they were very kind of Manichaean, black and white. There's no shady gray area, right? Where they said you were either for the continuation of this, to them, right? It not only was immoral, but it was archaic, right? Like from the Stone Age. That for one reason, right, is that slavery, it fostered a culture of dependence, where the slaves have to become pretty much sycophants. They have to become kiss-ups and do everything that the master wants them to do. But yet they cannot be honest with their master, right? And they have no incentive with wages, with a lack of wages. They have no incentive to work hard, right? And so it fosters this environment where the master himself becomes complacent, lazy, succumbs to his greed, right, his avarice, and the slaves are a force of insurrection waiting to happen, because they can't be honest with their masters, because they're clearly so mistreated as slaves, and because for those obvious reasons, right? And so to the Republicans, they also said that slavery was archaic. It was old school. It was obsolete, and it needs to be displaced by free labor, whereby people have a chance to earn a wage, and whereby people have a chance to advance up the socioeconomic ladder, right? Become a supervisor or a foreman at their job, et cetera, et cetera. That will give them the incentive in a practical level to work harder and to yield better results for everyone. And it also is more fair and more American on a more idealistic note, right? Because this is supposed to be the land of opportunity, of equality of opportunity. So at any rate, some of the radical Republicans even went so far, and the abolitionists. So the abolitionist is a more general term, and oftentimes the abolitionists did not directly involve themselves in politics. They were for moral persuasion. They used the lyceums, Lyceum. These were intellectual fairs where they would give speeches. They used the printed word, the large dissemination in the antebellum period of newspapers and magazines, right? And they used pamphlets, like in the Revolutionary War. And they sometimes even flooded the South, like Lewis and Arthur Tappan, wealthy brothers in the North, who tried to invade the South with anti-slavery literature. And needless to say, Southern senators and others were furious about this because they felt like it would have an insurrectionary effect on the slaves, encourage them to rebel. So at any rate, the abolitionists used the printed and the spoken word, but the radical Republicans were the politicians who were the equivalent of abolitionists, who took the same strong stance against slavery, but they wanted to actually utilize their political positions to bring that about, the end of slavery about. So they were seen as even more dangerous to the South, right? These radical Republican politicians. So hence, Charles Sumner was almost beaten to death in the Senate floor, the Senate chambers, for his mere words. And not to mention, he engaged in a very vituperative speech that denounced and made fun of and mocked Southern slave owners, in particular, one of the the oldest senators there in the South. So that elderly senator who was called out by him, his nephew, Preston Brooks, came in and almost beat Charles Sumner to death. And so, yeah, all this going on, right? And then in the 1850s, you had events oftentimes connected to the West that had a polarizing effect that almost forced people to pick a side, right? Like with magnetism, something forcing a polar pulling of the spectrum, right? And so, at any rate, what were some of those polarizing events that were almost coercing people to choose a side? You had the Compromise of 1850, and with California becoming a free state, they issued a strong anti-fugitive slave law, and 5 northern states issued laws saying they were not going to abide by it. This is a national compromise by Congress, and they're not abiding by it, 5 northern states. You had a case in Syracuse, New York, and elsewhere where a runaway slave was at a black church and then suddenly found himself surrounded by a Southern slave patrol posse, the black church surrounded by them. When he got out of church, they insisted that he be arrested and brought back to his Southern state. And his fellow constituents in the congregation refused to hand him over, and violence ensued. So now things are getting very emotionally polarizing, right? Such as the fugitive slave law. You also had, of course, the Nebraska and Kansas acts, whereby they decided the people in Kansas, the people in Nebraska would decide for themselves as they were applying for statehood if they wanted slavery or not. Well, in Kansas, both sides contended that the other side cheated in the election, which had truth on both sides, had grounds for that. And both sides refused to step down and stated that they won the election and the other did not. And it resulted in a civil war. It was known as Bleeding Kansas. And in this case, right, with these compromises, Zachary Taylor was pretty adamant that California become a slave state. So he kind of was somewhat, I mean, nowhere near an abolitionist, but he at least stood his ground against the Southern lobbyists for the spreading of slavery, right? And we'll never know what would have happened because he mysteriously died. He got sick and died as president. And when you look at his successors in court history, they're depicted as cowards. And so, you had, oh, don't film me now. I'm thinking of the guy's face. He lost his son in a train accident. Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to go back to into my book here. At any rate, you had President Buchanan, who didn't take too strong of a stance against slavery, despite being a Yankee. The other guy I'm thinking of, shame on me, my brain is just, like I said, I'm thinking of different things of his biography, his very appearance, and my brain is failing me as far as his name, but I'll get back to that in a second. But the 3 or 4 presidents before Abraham Lincoln did not take too strong of a stance. Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, at least those 2 presidents before Lincoln did not take a strong stance and allowed things to happen that just continued to spiral and having a polarizing effect on pulling people into 2 warring camps, North against South. And Lincoln is credited for having more of a moral compass and more of a backbone and taking a stance. So you not only had Bleeding Kansas and so forth, then you had the Dred Scott case. And with the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court under Roger B. Taney contended that it was the constitutional obligation of all state governments and of the federal government, right, to protect a man's right to his chattel property. So hence, right, if you are in a slave state and you own a tractor or a mule, if you move to a free state, that is still your tractor or mule and likened to a slave. I mean, the Dred Scott case was horrendous as far as the rationale for it and the implications. And this is an example of judicial activism, where the Supreme Court tried to formulate a policy by a decision instead of just making a decision according to the specifics therein and keeping it applicable only to that specific case. They were trying to make a statement here and try to get the federal government, particularly Congress, to feel obligated to protect the rights of slave owners everywhere in the U.S. So the Dred Scott case was responsible for bringing about a strong abolitionist counter movement. Abolitionists were frightened by and infuriated with the Dred Scott decision. Then you had the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, et cetera, right? And so with that, she had about 19 trips into the South and freed hundreds of people. And there was a rumor that a secret group of a secret 6 Northern senators were funding her. And to them, right, this was encouraging insubordination amongst all the Southern slaves. And it was tantamount to also defiance of the Constitution and their constitutional right to their, quote, chattel property. And it was theft, right? So it was seen as a very insurrectionary force. And so that also had a very polarizing effect. And then, of course, you had the caning of Charles Sumner in the Senate. So all these events are happening in the 1850s. And then ultimately, John Brown. John Brown tried to implement a slave insurrection in the South. He came down with a group of only about 21 men and tried to foment a slave rebellion by taking over Harper's Ferry federal fort in Virginia and trying to disseminate those weapons from that fort to the local slaves. And he was caught, wounded, captured, and hanged. And it had a very polarizing effect on both sides, needless to say. Like I said, Arthur and Lewis Tappan and the others who were flooding the South with literature, pro-South literature, had an insurrectionary, very polarizing effect and frightened the heck out of the South and angered it as far as its lobbyist powers, like John C. Calhoun and Breckinridge and others later after Calhoun, and Jefferson Davis. And you also had, like I said, Salmon Chase and other radical Republicans. They instituted a against the slave power campaign, where they were trying to get to win over poor white Southerners to the new Republican Party, contending that slavery hurts you, not just the slaves. Those slaves are taking jobs that could be offered to you as sharecroppers, etc., and that the slave owners do not have your interest in mind at all, and they're depriving you of opportunities of achieving the American dream. So to the white Southerners, right, this was tantamount to like class warfare that the Northern Republicans are trying to incite in the South, right? And so, yeah, a lot of information on number one. But so note, right? So with number one, it's court history. It's contending that this was a moral crusade, that a numerical minority known as abolitionists in particular and reformers in a more general sense, right, in the antebellum period, they rocked the boat in a good way. They forced the country to come to terms with slavery. They forced the country to have discourse on slavery. And then polarizing events of the 1850s tipped the scale and finished this process off and forced America to deal with this immoral institution and issue. Okay, so any questions about number one? I know it's a lot. All right, and so then number two just revises that. Number two states that this country did not fight the Civil War directly to end slavery, that it was not about slavery, okay, that it was about power, that it was about money. Nothing exceptional about it. So for one, right, is the faction thesis. Is, you know, James Madison used the term faction for a group that shares the same ideology and or the same self-interest. So we're looking at self-interest here. The idea is if people do the same thing for a living as you, chances are they're going to vote is what is in their best interest regarding what they do for a living, and they're going to vote the same way you do. So teachers, right? They don't have to befriend one another. It's a very cynical assumption, is that people, instead of looking for civic virtue and finding evidence of people voting for what's best for the entire country, they're just going to vote for what's best for themselves. So a teacher in Massachusetts, I don't need to meet, but if that person is an adjunct instructor like myself, that will likely vote the same way and become ipso facto allies without even meeting each other, because we're both going to do what's in our best interest. So hence, right, with the faction thesis is the Northern industrialists, right, that they wanted to create a Northern-like industrial-oriented society in the West. They wanted to make a, quote, mini-me out of the West, right? Because what would be good for them will be good for those in the West, and vice versa. I think of like first effective settlement theory. So at any rate, moving it to the West, they wanted, because also they were promising their voters, right, free labor. But get this, right, like with the Free Soil Party, etc. Some of them promised no job to inwards, but only jobs to white men, to poor white men. So get that, right? You could oppose slavery and be as racist as they come for all the wrong reasons, whereby you want white men to get that agricultural job or to get that factory job and not black men. And the Free Soil Party, you look at some of the people who advocated the platform of the Free Soil Party, which didn't last very long, and you can find evidence of that, of opposing slavery for all the wrong reasons. The abolitionists constituted about 2.5% of the population, they think. That's a tiny minority that made a lot of noise disproportionate to those small numbers, right? But nevertheless, a tiny minority. So what do the majority of Northerners think? Well, you have books that are like the counterpart to the Life of Johnny Reb book that state that a lot of Northern soldiers, in their estimation, when asked by reporters, etc., did not feel enthusiastic about fighting for black slaves and risking their life and limb for black slaves that they had never met. But instead, they often stated that the South cannot leave the Union. They can't secede from the country. So they're fighting to keep the Union together only. Some of them resented the political manipulation and lobbyist power of the particular faction of planters, of slave owners. But it was more just that, as they resented the power of the slave owners and them throwing their weight around in Congress, but not specifically out of sympathy for their slaves. There is evidence of an initial anger because of the events at Fort Sumter. It was assumed that the South started the war. So there was enthusiasm, perhaps for that reason. But as things got gritty by 1862 and 1863, Abraham Lincoln and others attest to the fact that there was a lot of apathy amongst Northern soldiers and anger and loss of interest. So much for, the majority of them wanting to seeing this as a noble crusade to free the slaves. Look at the way the Northern Army treated slaves, runaway slaves and black men. They did not trust giving them guns and were very hesitant and took a long time and arguably didn't do so until they got war weary and even, dare I say, desperate before they finally put guns into the hands of black men to fight with the Union and for the Union. There were draft riots in New York in 1863. Yes, predominantly against the draft, but also that included attacks on black orphanages and hospitals and crowds chanting, "We won't die for the N-words." Great man history, looking at the personalities and decisions made by political leaders like President Lincoln. He wrote back to Horace Greeley and stated, "My chief aim in this contest is to save the Union, and it is not to free the slaves." He spoke to a crowd and said he was not for the social and political equality of black and white men. And insomuch as there needs to be a position of superior and inferior, he, as much as any white man, was for the white man being in a superior position. But he just wanted slavery to end. It was a whole other can of worms, right? To give them complete political equality and a sure next step to espouse social equality, whereby you would allow your white daughter to marry a black man, for instance. So there were many different levels amongst the abolitionists and others, right? And very few went to that, what would be acceptable today, to complete political and social equality. And of course, that would not include Lincoln. Then Lincoln allowed Kentucky to keep their slaves in return for them fighting for the North rather than the South as a border state. Can you believe that? But in his defense, he used a chess analogy to one of his cabinet members who was furious over this decision. And he said basically, right, that timing is everything. He said, I must first appear to be almost indifferent about slavery, or I won't even win re-election here in the North. Because you look at the Democrats in the North who said this war was unnecessary. The South should have been allowed the opportunity to extend slavery into the West. And they were winning office. And they were gaining a following in the North, not just the South. They were known as Copperheads during the war. So he said, I must first appear to be more indifferent to slavery than I really am. He says, secondly, I need the help of the border states like Kentucky and Tennessee. And he says, once I get their help, I no longer need their help. And the tide of the war turns in our favor. He said, they don't know it yet, but I'll eventually force them to get rid of their slaves too. I'm using them, he said, in his chess analogy. Well, revisionist historians, like with number 2, they're not apt to let him so easily off the hook. And they see a moderate at best, a very shrewd and manipulative man who first and foremost was worried about his own reputation of keeping the country together and winning the war, and then slightly sacrificing, risking his skin to give some opportunities to black men. Now, there's no doubt he supported the 13th Amendment to end slavery everywhere. There's no doubt of that. There's no doubt either that he did force Kentucky to get rid of their slaves as well. He has famous letters to them telling them that he was going to give them a special out, that he was not allowing anybody else in gratitude to their military help. And that was gradual compensated emancipation. Separating the slaves at 30 years of age. I can't remember which group was which. One group was automatically bought or purchased by the government at market price, and the other group above or below 30 had to remain a slave for life. And Kentucky would not, the diplomatic leaders would not accept it. And he has a famous letter saying, sorry, I gave you your chance. Now I'm going to treat you no different from everybody else in the South. I'm just going to take them. And so the 13th Amendment established that. But before the 13th Amendment, his Emancipation Proclamation, right? Did that declare all slaves free? No, only the slaves of rebels. Again, giving that Kentucky offer to everybody else in the South. That if you remain loyal to the North, you can keep your slaves for now. So Lincoln was a shrewd man. So according to this thesis, right, only when the U.S. became more militarily desperate and more culturally and psychologically in need of having a grand cause to fight for, when the death tally got so high. did Lincoln begin to make this war about slavery. So hence, of course, right, what we learned as kids, the Gettysburg Address. Says he wants to make sure that the men who died at Gettysburg, right, and elsewhere, did not die in vain, but that we're going to bring about a new birth of freedom so that a government of, by, and for the people won't perish. That our forefathers established a government predicated on the assumption that all men are created equal. And we're fighting to keep that special type of republic alive. So no doubt that speech taken at face value is supportive of court history, right? That this was a crusade to end slavery. But revisionists say, no, he took way too long to issue it. And by then he was just trying to give a cause, a reason for fighting and dying to the North, in light of 300,000 men losing their lives for him. All right. So evidence of racism in the North as well as in the South. What were there, 19 northern states against 11 southern? And in the 19 northern states, only 5 granted some citizenship rights to some Black men. That's not very impressive, is it? The way the government dragged its feet in implementing the 13th Amendment. The spirit of the Confiscation Acts. Confiscation Acts were enacted both by Congress and independently by some Union leaders in the war. And oftentimes they would just rather vindictively take the slaves away from the slave owners when they conquered a certain area in the South, and then use those slaves to dig latrines, to cook and clean, and do the work that nobody in the Union Army wanted to do. So was their intention of freeing the slaves rather spiteful, kind of a divide and conquer tactic, right? Rather than a humanitarian crusade. And that is finally it, you guys. Are there any questions about number 2? All right, thank you for hanging in there. All right, again, you know how to contact me if you have any questions. And very shortly here, I will finally start catching up on grading. Thank you for your patience with that. All right, so if there aren't any other, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, I said thank you.
Thank you, Mireya.
Professor, I had a question really quick.
Sure.
Are we doing Zooms next week as well for like preparation for test number 3? And I know we have an essay to write, or
That's right. We have one more assignment and it's a different format. I'm asking you to choose one question, to write a short essay on. And so absolutely, I intend to try to help you with both of them.
okay, sounds good. Thank you.
No problem. All right. Okay, guys, so if there aren't any other questions, that's it for today. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor.
Bye-bye. Thank you.